A warm welcome to this virtual session at the 2020 ASOF. It's great to be finally together in a format that it's a bit different to what we originally had expected, but with a full prospect of having an interesting discussion ahead of us. So my name is Anne-Kathrin Jäger, and I'm a scientific officer at the European Research Council Executive Agency, and I will be moderating this session. But before I turn to presenting our speakers and the way we will carry out the session, let me briefly remind all of us why we actually propose to organize this session. So the session looks at collaborative approaches, using and reusing of products and services. I mean, the collaborative economy is quite a buzzword these days and has quite a prominent place in the discussion about concepts of circular economy transition, and not least in the context of the discussion of the European Green Deal. And to have products and services better shared and reused and avoid waste to the extent possible bears immense sustainability potential. I think we all can agree to that. But however, what is needed to make such collaborative economy approaches really become a new paradigm of economic and societal life? Because in many ways, sharing and reusing is not the norm in the day-to-day life. And the presentation today will look particularly at drawing lessons from innovative practice in cities. So many cities function as the laboratories of change, with respect to collaborative practices and offering therefore the possibility to understand the potentials better, but also the limitations. And to what extent is the focus on increased efficiency the solution to a transition to a sustainable future? And what is the importance of the social and cultural context? So this panel will examine these questions by looking particularly at the area of food consumption, but also mobility practices, shared accommodation, and sharing physical goods in urban context. And with this session, we would like to shed fresh light on the innovation potentials of sharing, particularly in the urban context and respective governance and institutional arrangements. And the factors will help to elaborate the potential of sharing economies, and with a local action can scale towards a real transformative change, because in the end, that's the interesting question, how to get to a real change. I'm very happy to welcome our three speakers to this session who will address this complex contest. All of them are grantees from the European Research Council. I will introduce the speakers in a minute, but before we start, I would like to encourage the audience to ask questions. You know, you can add questions at any time via the chat function. And when you do so, it could be useful that you specify to whom of the speakers you will address the question. And if you want, you can also give your name or your background, being a scientist or journalist or teacher. And since all of the presentations will look at the same broad topic, but from different perspectives and approaches, we will discuss all together at the end of the session. Now, let me turn to present the first speaker. That's Oksana Mont. Oksana Mont is a professor in sustainable consumption governance. She leads a research group on sustainable consumption governance at the International Institute for Industrial and Environmental Economics at Lund University. And she conducts interdisciplinary and international research on sustainable business models, sustainable consumption and lifestyle, and sustainable consumption policy. Her current topical domain is the sharing economy and circular economy. And today, Oksana will share with us her most recent findings and insights of her ERC project, Urban Sharing, Sustainability and Institutionalization Pathways. Please, Oksana.
Hello? Do you hear me?
Where is it? The technician is not here.
Ann-Katrin, do you hear me?
I hear you. I hear you perfectly.
Okay,
Well.
but then maybe...
But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Oksana Mont. I come from Sweden, from Lund University, and today I would like to present to you our preliminary results from ERC-funded project called Urban Sharing, Sustainability and Institutionalization. Our project aims to look at three particular aspects of sharing economy. We look at sharing economy organizations, and we're looking at how they are designed, what their business models are. We are trying to develop tools to evaluate multidimensional sustainability impacts of the sharing economy organizations. And we are interested to explore how institutionalization process of sharing economy unfold in diverse urban contexts. This is an international project where we look at 5 cities, which are Amsterdam, Toronto, Shanghai, Seoul, and Melbourne. I have a team of 8 researchers, some postdocs who are running half the time of the project. And we are looking at sectors where we look at tangible goods because we are interested to evaluate sustainability, and it's easier to evaluate environmental sustainability, at least when we look at tangible goods. So we are looking at 3 sectors, space, mobility, and physical goods. Our unit of analysis is dual, so we are looking, as I said previously, at urban sharing organizations, but we are also looking at them in the city context. So we are also looking at specifically the role of city councils, municipalities in shaping the landscape of urban sharing. Our methodology is quite diverse. We have interviews, we do mobile research labs where we visit different cities, we do workshops with stakeholders in the cities. We also develop, as I said, tools for sustainability impact assessment, such as life cycle and input-output or hybrid of these two. So it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative data. And today I will be drawing on our findings, preliminary findings from 3 cities, Amsterdam, Toronto, and Shanghai, that are part of our ERC project. Also leaning on the data we've collected in our previous projects, where we look with similar examples at Berlin, London, San Francisco, Malmö, and Gothenburg that were funded by Swedish funding agencies. So today I will be talking about looking at our third focal area, which is institutionalization. Why are we interested in sharing economy in the first place? For us, it's been a starting point was from the organizational perspective. And they are interesting because they are unlike any other organizations we previously had in the history of humankind. They are triadic business models, meaning it's not, as usual, traditionally a company that is producing goods and providing it to consumers. Here we have a dual market where we have resource owner, a person or a company that owns assets, products, or provides services. We have resource user, also oftentimes it's private individuals, but can also be businesses who would like to gain access to these goods or services. And we have a platform, a mediator, a market that is in control of these transactions between these 2 actors. Why is it interesting? Well, platform is usually web or app-based. Their revenue mostly comes from fixed or variable commissions and differ substantially between different sectors. And when we look at in real life markets or sharing platforms, they are often non-profit. When we look at resource owners, they are own assets They have flexibility in deciding how many working hours they would like to put in engaging with the platform. And 85% of the gross revenue of what we associate with the platform actually goes to the resource owners. When we look at resource users, on the other hand, they are also engaging with the platform. They're not just passive consumers buying products and then they disengage from the provider. In these cases, resource users, they are actively engaged through rating systems, for example, and interestingly enough, they pay per use of products, so gaining temporary access to products. It's also interesting from institutional perspective because these organizations, they really challenge prevalent institutions we see in our society. We are traditionally, as I said, used to large companies, producers who have power, and they're usually corporations that own assets and have traditional innovation cycle. With the platforms, we see that they're tiny startups that are supported with large venture capitalists, or they are small non-profit local organizations without really growth aspirations. So these two types also both challenge the traditional companies in different ways. Resource owner also, this is not really a profession as we're used to, but this is something many people do in their spare time. For some, this does become the main source of income. When we look at the resource user, it's also through their rating systems. Usually it's the state that has the role of controlling agency that looks that the market functions properly. With the platform economy, it's the resource users themselves who have this control function through these review systems. So it's very different to the traditional ways. And then also, as I said, there is a big difference between for-profit and non-profit organizations. For-profit sharing really doesn't create social belonging or contributes to social capital, some say. And people say it's not in their DNA there because the main goal is profit maximization. While non-profit, local, and often non-linked to app or web sharing organizations, they really don't have growth ambition and they are often ideologically driven, which means also that they have difficulty surviving economically in the long run. So in this project, our also question is how do they get institutionalized? Who are the actors that have the power and agency to act in this institutionalization processes? We specifically look at the role of municipalities and the urban sharing organizations, but of course there are other actors such as academia, third-party organizations, or even sharing economy industry associations. And we see this institutional dynamics being twofold. One is the institutional work of USOs, what we call urban sharing organizations. They are the agents that can question the prevailing institutions and develop their own or exchange the prevailing institutions, substitute them with the new ones. And the role of municipalities is largely governance, seeing to that sharing economy is developing in the direction that city at least wants. So when we look at institutionalization, we started our work with that by developing a framework using Lawrence and Sotheby framework for institutionalization and how different organizations can create institutions. We adapted it to the sharing economy. And in this framework, the authors distinguish between regulatory, normative, and cultural cognitive work. So this is the main three mechanisms or directions how urban sharing organizations can engage in creating or questioning current institutions. I'll briefly give you some examples. When we talk about regulatory institutions, we all know that especially large and loud organizations such as Uber and Airbnb have been very active in litigating, basically suing the governments, municipalities, if they set up the rules that these organizations see as unfair or limiting their business opportunities. So from all around the world, we see now examples that these and many other companies are fighting their way through to survival. They also engage, of course, in lobbying, and some lobby in kind of more positive way, trying to persuade the governments, countries that they are the good guys, that they are pro-sustainable, and that's why they need support or need to be left alone to prosper. Also interesting mechanism is delimiting organizational fields, basically saying what is this field called sharing economy, who is in and who is out. And there we see very different developments when small companies are saying, we are not a part of the sharing economy because there is no money involved in our transactions or in our community of sharers. While big companies sometimes say that we are not, we are big tech companies, so we are not, we should be excluded from being regulated. When we look at normative mechanisms, there we see, for example, forming normative networks, for example, inter-industrial associations or intra-industrial associations, where also organizations such as Sharing Economy UK or AU Collab take active role in lobbying for the interests of sharing economy organizations at European or national level. Another interesting thing is creating identities and constructing images. So these new organizations, they have to find their way to profile themselves, to distinguish themselves, but also to associate themselves with other organizations. So when we quickly looked at the social media and the company web pages, we see that for-profit organizations profile themselves through such words as we are being smart, sustainable, new technology involved, we provide access and opportunity for all. While non-profit organizations, they talk about much more community, social cohesion, inclusion, small is beautiful. And both these groups, organizations, they profile themselves as a better alternative compared to the incumbent companies such as hotels or taxi businesses or typical food or retail chains. Also, interestingly, they alter traditional meaning systems. They, for example, discuss the institution of ownership, how prevalent it is, and they talk about it as being wasteful and burdensome. Also, traditional meaning of sharing, we know it as sharing, for example, in networks of friends, people we know, or within the family, so true sharing, while they define it as transaction-based for-profit sharing economy. When we look at cognitive institutions, there we see they're developing new meaning systems. We see emergence of new currencies, new verbs. Now we all use to Uber, meaning to fetch a ride, ride-hailing, or to Airbnb, something. We also see other sectors than Airbnb and Uber, so basically the mobility or space sharing, they also use these terms and say it's the Airbnb of food sharing. So creating new vocabulary and meanings. Also, we see imitating and transferring, meaning that these new organizations, they also imitate the structures that are prevalent in the traditional organizations. Many traditional companies have advisory boards, so we've seen that Airbnb has also started up a sustainability advisory board. Vimdu is a site for space accommodation sharing. They market themselves as being providing a feeling as hotel rooms, but better than a hotel. And then also, of course, we see they are copying each other a lot in different sectors. And there are some cross-sectoral transfer of business models as well, which is very interesting. Finally, they are also engaging in educating and communicating. We see companies that teach their users, resource users and resource owners to lobby, for example, local city councils. We see organizations communicating about their sustainability credentials as they see them. They also see organizations linking their profile to other types of benefits, including health. So our preliminary observations from the work on institutions is that we see that non-profit organizations often gain legitimacy by being distinctly different from the mainstream urban sharing organizations, the big and the loud of the sharing economy, but they lack the power and resources to engage in political work. While the big and the loud sharing organizations who have the power and the financial and political power, they really engage in litigation, lobbying, and in setting the agenda in many cities. Also, what we find when we ask urban sharing organizations when in their work with sustainability, they say that it's much easier to engage in discussion with local governments that they could demonstrate common sustainability goals, and many organizations shape their messages towards government based on their sustainability profile or activities. Now, the second part of my presentation looks at the other part of institutionalization of sharing economy, which is governance. And we look at the role of municipal governments in the sharing economy. Also in this work, we developed a governance framework where we distinguish 5 mechanisms: regulating, providing, self-governing, collaborating, and enabling. And we talk about 11 roles of how municipal governments can engage with sharing. We do now, in the process of data coding, we have data from 8 cities, from different projects, and about 170 interviews. So we are now coding the data and looking at the type of patterns that are emerging. And it's a very interesting work because now we can really compare the different mechanisms and roles and see in which context they emerge, and then we ask questions, of course, why. Our next
example, in Amsterdam, that's an example
stage
of city
is
that has an entire range of type of engagement with the sharing economy, from prohibiting to regulating, from being neutral, encouraging, and supporting. London and Berlin are similar in that we haven't identified any directly supporting mechanisms, but we see all other mechanisms and spectrum being present. Gothenburg and Malmö, 2 Swedish cities, they are similar in that they do not have prohibiting or regulating engagements, because these are taken care of at the national level, but very much encouraging and supporting mechanisms, and especially for community-based and non-profit urban sharing organizations. San Francisco and Toronto, again, similar cities where we didn't find much of prohibiting anything, but neither encouraging or supporting. They either have neutral stance or they regulate, for example, short-term home rentals in both cities, and in Toronto also regulates car sharing and ride hailing.
And then we are asking nowadays ourselves the question why we see these differences in how cities engage with the sharing economy. And we find some of the important answers when we look at the contextual factors of cities, including structural factors such as regulations and infrastructure, political economic factors, where we look at the type of economies and their governing principles. We look at the type of electoral logics and voting systems across cities. Sustainability factors also play an important role, where sustainability challenges are seen by some cities and other cities see sustainability opportunities and aspirations. And also, finally, we just started working with looking at cultural factors, and we rely on the cultural theory and Hofstadter's model, which distinguishes 6 dimensions of different cultures, including power distance, individualism, collectivism, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity, femininity, short-term orientation, and indulgent restraint. Finally, I would like to thank you all for listening to me, and I encourage you all to come and visit our website. We have videos, we have snapshots from our cities, we have sticker reports for those who are interested in details of our work. We have also a podcast on scooter sharing, and we also have a massive online course for those who are interested in understanding better urban sharing in cities in many different countries. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Oksana, for that interesting presentation. Our next speaker is Anna Davis. Anna is Professor of Geography, Environment and Society at Trinity College Dublin, where she directs the Environmental Governance Research Group, and she is on the steering committee for the Trinity Center for Future Cities. In addition to her academic work, she has been appointed member of different research committees and expert groups. So she chairs the Royal Irish Academy Future Earth Island Expert Group. She is a member of the RIA Geographical and Geosciences Committee and the Planning and Environment Research Group of the Royal Geographical Society. She also provides policy advice in different functions. She advises the Irish government in her role as the independent member of the National Economic and Social Council and as a member of the National Climate Change Council. Very recently, she has been awarded the ESC Public Engagement with Research Award 2020 in the category Online and Social Media for her ESC project, Share City. And today, the title of her presentation is Urban Food Sharing, Innovations, Governments, and Sustainability. And we are looking forward to that.
Thank you for the introduction and to Oksana for her fascinating talk. I'm delighted to be able to participate in this panel today exploring the transformational capacities of locally based collaborative approaches in urban settings. I'll be focusing on my research conducted as part of the ERC funded project Share City, which has been examining the practices and sustainability potential of ICT mediated food sharing initiatives in urban areas since 2016. I'll be reflecting on the diverse nature of food sharing activities I've encountered and the innovations they embody, as well as the governance challenges they face in meeting their goals. I'll conclude with a reflection on our ongoing attempts to document and communicate the sustainability impacts of food sharing initiatives and what the implications of this are for assessing the transformative capacity of food sharing. But first, I'll provide some background to my focus on food and urban food sharing in particular. Earlier this year, SAPEA, an organisation which brings together expertise from over 100 academies and is part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism, was commissioned to produce an evidence review report on the transition towards a more just and sustainable food system for the European Union. The report concluded that we face severe challenges in meeting the nutritional needs of the world's population in ways which are sustainable, economically, environmentally, and socially. At the same time, there's growing clarity regarding the unsustainability of urban areas, particularly cities. We know that already more than half the world's population live in cities, and this level is expected to rise to nearly 70% by 2050. And cities consume more than 3/4 of natural resources and produce more than 1.3 billion tonnes of waste every year, half of which is organic and mostly food waste. Such waste is particularly abhorrent given the persistence of hunger and food insecurity. Around 1 billion people still go hungry despite global food production increasing substantially over the past century. The current COVID pandemic has reinforced the urgency of addressing these unsustainabilities. In Scarcity, we are exploring whether food sharing provides a positive contribution to that endeavour. What do I mean by food sharing? As this definition on the slide indicates, we define food sharing as doing things differently around food. This could be sharing food itself, as well as gardening tools and kitchen utensils. It can also include sharing the skills or spaces for growing, cooking, eating, and redistributing food collaboratively. Food sharing is a practice as old as human civilization itself, but technological developments, increasing awareness of environmental issues and widespread economic challenges have transformed practices of sharing, effectively stretching them into new spaces and scales beyond familiar and familial contexts. Prior to these developments, research tended to focus on small-scale societies, particularly those of hunter-gatherers, where food sharing often extends beyond the nuclear family. This focus is important as these types of societies reflect the bulk of human experience over our 2 million year history, but it really doesn't incorporate the experiences of many people living in mixed market economies today. A resurgence of interest in sharing more broadly has been stimulated by concerns about the atomization of contemporary life and the lack of opportunities that it provides for social interaction. A new area of concern for scholars of sharing is the potential for it to reduce some of the negative environmental impacts of current modes of production and consumption, providing opportunities to reduce food waste or increase urban biodiversity. And it's in this context that my project Scarcity was formulated. In Scarcity, which is an interdisciplinary team-based project, we're focusing on these new ICT-mediated practices of urban food sharing, identifying the relevant rules, both regulatory and social, tools, skills, and understandings that shape its practice, and exploring the actual and potential sustainability impacts it generates. Overall, our goal was to establish the significance and potential of food sharing initiatives to help transition urban spaces onto more sustainable pathways. And we're doing this by developing deeper understanding of contemporary food sharing, generating international empirical data about urban food sharing activities, assessing the impact of these, and exploring how food sharing institutes might evolve in the future. The first step of our research was to establish the landscape of ICT-mediated urban food sharing internationally, as these kinds of practices are rarely visible to those who are not directly involved in them. Our focus on the ICT-mediated component of urban food sharing provided us with the means to identify their digital traces from our computers. To focus our research, we began by identifying 100 diverse urban areas across 43 countries and multiple continents. And following a 6-month process of web scraping and crowdsourcing, we were able to uncover and categorize more than 4,000 initiatives, identifying their stated goals, what they share, the modes of sharing they employ, and the organizational structures that the food sharing initiatives themselves adopt. We've been conducting annual checks of the contacts for each initiative and have found about a 5% erosion rate year on year. From this data, we created an interactive searchable database, the Scarcity 100, which is freely available from our website, which is www.scarcity.ie. The aim of this was to increase the visibility of food sharing activities internationally, to allow food sharing initiatives to make contact with others in their own urban area or across urban areas internationally, and to inspire those who would like to share to engage with existing activities or start their own. We like to think we've achieved some of these aims. To date, we've nearly had more than 14,000 searches of the database from across more than 100 countries. What we found was a huge diversity of food sharing initiatives, both within and between urban areas, with large, wealthy cities with good ICT infrastructures, unsurprisingly appearing at the top of our rankings. However, accounting for population size, we found that there are also hotspots for food sharing amongst smaller urban areas, particularly where there's a history of progressive activities around food. As illustrated on this slide, there's a diversity within food sharing initiatives. We found them as multifunctional activities. More than 2/3 share a combination of food-related stuff, spaces, and skills. and more than half use multiple methods to share, although selling and gifting predominate. The range of organisational models is also broad, with a predominance of forms beyond mainstream commercial business models. As useful as the database was for providing an overview of urban food sharing, it was impossible to understand their activities and impacts of the activities from their online presence alone. We used the database to identify cities from across multiple countries and continents in which to undertake in-depth research. We identified 9 cities shown on this map, and researchers spent 6 months in each location conducting interviews with key stakeholders and participating in food sharing with 40 food sharing initiatives. There's no time really to delve into the details of this today, but findings are summarised in a short book called Urban Food Sharing, and there's a free PDF version available from the publisher's website and the links provided here. Rather, today I'd like to focus on the questions of innovation and transformation in the activities that we found. Taking innovation in its broadest sense, there are a number of noteworthy practices amongst the food sharing initiatives we identified. Some involving new products, such as an open access online maps of urban harvests managed by Ripe Near Me, based in Australia. Others providing new ways to deliver familiar or long-standing services, such as augmentation of surplus food redistribution activities, as developed by Food Cloud in Ireland. Both of these initiatives have extended technological innovations which emerged in the 21st century for application in the food space. These technological advances have also stimulated the adoption of new business models. Here I'm thinking of initiatives like Eat With, which is a commercial social dining platform. In other cases, technologies have been adopted to reinvigorate historical sharing practices, as with the Foodscape Collective in Singapore. Environmental innovations have focused on new ways to organise the use of inedible food waste, as with the New York City Community Composting Project, and to integrate niche practices such as regenerative agriculture into urban settings, as in the Skip Garden and Kitchen in London. Perhaps most significantly, food sharing is replete with social innovations, whether that be supporting communities to identify spaces for commoning, as with the 596 Acres organisation in New York, or utilising food as a means to support communities by facilitating community cohesion, as in the Intercultural Community Garden in Berlin, Himmelbeet. Whether these are radical or incremental innovations really depends on the context in which they emerge and the frames of reference being used to evaluate the innovations. The question "innovative for whom" is significant in this context. Commoning through collective gardening, for example, is an old practice, but it could be considered radical in a hyper-privatised urban area with little open space. Ultimately, we found that innovations in food sharing are often multifaceted. On this slide, you can see how food sharing initiatives from London to Singapore articulate their actions, many providing socio-environmental innovation, using the practices of collective growing here to provide new connections for people and between people and the planet. But there are challenges. As the selection of media articles on this slide illustrates, despite these innovations, food sharing initiatives often experience a precarious existence. Whether food sharing initiatives flourish or fade is not only down to the energies of those who establish and participate in them. Government policies play an important role in shaping food sharing activities. As in many places, governments tend to regulate food activities as if they were either solely or commercial businesses or entirely private matters. As a result, any social, environmental and health benefits that accrue from food sharing, which don't fit neatly into either of these boxes, are often missed or disciplined. For example, attempts by food sharing initiatives to move from seeing food as a commodity to food as commons, as with the surplus food redistributor foodsharing.de in Germany, are often constrained because food safety regulations require the identification of a responsible individual to manage food risk. It's hard for food risk to be held in common under a food system which sees food predominantly as a commodity. There are reasons to be optimistic. Matters of governance are dynamic, and while we know that localities have unique histories, cultures and regimes, food sharing initiatives can still learn from each other's experiences, as there are many challenges in common. We know this because we held a 2-day workshop at the end of last year with academics, practitioners and policy shapers from across Europe and North America. We asked participants to augment the governance challenge matrix that we had developed from our research, and we asked them to vote on those which they felt were most significant in their experience. This process confirms that we had identified many of the commonplace challenges in our research, and it also generated a rich debate. For community growing, the top challenges were insecure land access due to a lack of long-term planning for shared growing spaces by planners and policymakers. A lack of common language to communicate the positive impacts of urban growing and shared growing between different stakeholders involved was also a major challenge. The predominance of powerful commercial and financial interests that are given priority when it comes to forming policy and shaping planning decisions was a key concern that was held across the different food sharing sectors. For collective cooking and eating events, it was the complex and fragmented policy landscape around food that caused significant concern, as well as wider inequalities within society that lead to inequitable access to nutritious and sustainable food. For food surplus distribution initiatives, participants emphasised the lack of joined-up actions to reduce food waste across the food system and a lack of robust data in relation to food waste and food surplus. However, despite these manifold challenges, participants were also able to identify responses that enabled food sharing initiatives to sustain their activities. In the community growing sector, for example, participants mentioned that in Oslo, a change in building codes helped secure public spaces for growing. And in both UK and the USA, examples were given where lawsuits and legal tools were able to protect land used for community gardens. However, many challenges remain unresolved, and illustrated on this slide, which collected the parting insights from Sharing Food's Futures workshop. A number of actions we are responding to currently in the ShareST project. So developing a sustainability metrics for food sharing, highlighting stories of successful initiatives, creating umbrella lobby groups for grassroots food sharing, and demonstrating and communicating the social and ecological value of activities. Our research found that while all the initiatives we worked with express either social, economic, or environmental goals, few conducted any formal reporting of impact. This is not surprising. Many food sharing initiatives have limited time, money, and skills available to take on such additional tasks. They were often battling just to survive. While it's relatively easy to count the amount of food produced, consumed, or shared, and some surplus food redistribution initiatives such as Food Cloud are already doing this very effectively, it's much more difficult to establish how shared experiences make a difference to people in terms of their emotional or social needs. Simply counting participants really doesn't convey the quality of experiences. So we worked with a number of food sharing initiatives to co-design a tool explicitly for those small, new, precarious initiatives who rarely report and who struggle to use existing reporting tools. The Share It toolkit involves three main features. The tool shared, which incorporates an indicators-based framework where initiatives select appropriate metrics from 34 on offer and enter data, which can be qualitative or quantitative. The tool shed then generates a full and summary report that the initiatives can then use in any way they see fit. The Talent Garden provides an online space for food sharers to promote the findings of their reports and share narrative stories in text or graphic form about their impact. And finally, the Greenhouse, which is an online portal through which food sharers can meet with each other. Groups can share learning, knowledge, and inspiration, a kind of dating site for food sharers. Our next step is to test different user support models for activating engagement with Share It by directly approaching initiatives listed on our ShareST 100 database. The output reports from the toolshed will be brought to a range of policymakers and funding agents to gain feedback on how useful they are for informing their decision-making. Equipped with the feedback from food sharers, policymakers, and funding agencies, we hope to upgrade the Share It tool, improving the output report presentation and translating key aspects of the tool into multiple languages. If you're interested to find out more, the tool is available from our website and you can simply just register to gain access. So the focus of this panel was to ask whether local practices such as food sharing can lead to transformative change in a collaborative economy. Based on our analysis of innovation, governance, and sustainability, we can safely say that there are cases where food sharing initiatives were transformative for those involved, but not all food sharing initiatives had transformative goals in mind. Commercial social dining platforms, for example, provided for predominantly superficial social encounters, generated limited, if any, environmental benefits, and rarely provided secure income for economic diversification. It's basically platform capitalism and transactional rather than transformational sharing. As Sharon Ede noted back in 2014, Transformational sharing incorporates an additional critical element. It involves a shift in power and social relations. This means considering who owns and controls the processes by which sharing occurs, who benefits, and whether it's strengthening the commons or resulting in an increase in commodification of our lives. It's also the case that food sharing initiatives we examined were not always or entirely local or place-based. Some are highly networked or international in scope. Essentially, not all food sharing is equal with respect to either its sustainability goals or their ability to contribute to sustainability transformations around food in urban areas. Also, it's important to remember that what is transformative in one locality might not be so transformative in another. Context is key. We need a suite of changes to rules, tools, skills, and understandings that work together, combining and aligning towards common goals. And we will need new frames and new imaginaries to guide us. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Anna, for this very interesting presentation. Before we go to the next presentation, I just want to remind our audience that you can post questions at any time. Even so, we will answer them only in the discussion, in the common discussion afterwards. So our next speaker is Christina Grasseni. Christina is professor of anthropology at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And she holds an ESC grant that examines the different types, premises, and consequences of collective forms of food production, distribution, and consumption in 3 European cities. Today, Christina will give a presentation with the title, Sharing Food is Caring. Christina, please.
Thank you for having me. I'm Christina Grasseni. I'm a cultural anthropologist at Leiden University. Thanks for this invitation and also for the illuminating presentations before me. I wish to address some of the questions posed by the panel abstract from the point of view of my own ongoing project. Which is about collective food procurement networks, and I will explain briefly what I mean by that. I want to argue that in order to answer this question, can local practices of food provisioning, in this case, turn into transformative change? We need to look profoundly at contexts, especially at the diversity of contexts. The methodology we use in this team, which I will present later one by one, is to compare ethnographically multiple levels and different sites of collective food procurement. And what I mean by these networks is groups of people who work together to either produce or gather, foraging, or to buy, share, gift, short chains, or to lobby, discuss, and deliberate about what kind of food they should procure together at municipal level. So there is the focus on different levels of understanding of collective food procurement. The methodology is mainly fieldwork, which means that every member of the team has conducted more than 15 months of fieldwork in one of the cities that I will present now. So the methodology is based on living through a specific context. We also use interviews, focus groups, and we also use audiovisual methods. I don't have time to go into this, but you will find the full protocol for the research at the website of the project foodcitizens.eu. The cities are three. There are 3 European cities, Gdansk, Turin, and Rotterdam. we thought they would be representative of several macro areas within Europe. And we thought that it would be important to compare them to let the diversity and the idiosyncrasies of the different initiatives that can be found in each city come to the fore. So in a certain way, to see the people behind the cities. Why compare? Of course, comparing is widely used. It's also widely interpreted. In this particular case, from a so-called ethnographic point of view, that's a phrase that we use a lot in anthropology, it doesn't necessarily mean to measure variations of one single phenomenon across different sites. It is actually the opposite of that. It's about investigating broadly defined phenomena in different places so that the diversity of each instantiation actually comes to the fore. This type of diversity tells us something more about the contexts, not only about the nature of the phenomena that we are investigating. And this is a key methodological issue for us. Why is that so? Why compare? The basic tenet behind this anthropological project is that if we want to understand styles of procurement, and if we want to change them, of course, in the direction of innovation, of governments, and of sustainability, we also need to understand how they are informed by particular styles of participation. Participation in a socioeconomic system, in a society, in a culture, in a political system. So we will find different styles of procurement informed by different styles of participation, and vice versa. This will inform the different nuanced ways in which, for example, we find instantiations of broad models such as community-supported agriculture or urban agriculture in different places. Let me explain this more in detail. The panel asked us to develop new insights on innovative practices, on sustainability potentials, and governance implications. And with this work in progress project, I basically want to ask the question of where we can start getting these insights. And once we get these insights, are they actually scalable? So if you want, I want to complexify this idea of the scalability of these insights. So this gives you a very matrix-like grid of the kind of sites that we've been exploring ethnographically in the 3 cities under the 3 categories of foraging, of short chains, and of governance that I've illustrated before. We've basically been looking at social gardens, but also institutional types of allotments. Some of them have a long tradition in these cities, for example, in the Polish context. But also we've been looking at entirely grassroots, spontaneous forms or schemes of food distribution, especially free food distribution, including international phenomena like food not bombs in Turin and Gdansk. And at the short chain level, we've been looking also at open air markets and at the microcultures that develop around them and how they are connected with self-provisioning, but also box schemes of the types of the digital platforms, for example, that Oksana has been talking about, and various forms of solidarity networks. At the level of governance, we've been sometimes participating, sometimes observing various projects in the 3 cities. This is not the level that I'm going to talk about now in particular. What I want to stress is that each of these categories are diversely interpreted, acted out, and practiced in each city. And also there are porous boundaries among them. It may well be that at the governance level, we find projects that are actually very influential also at the foraging level. So that is one thing to keep in mind, the porosity and the fluidity of the classificatory systems that we use ourselves. Some practical examples. These come from the ethnographic investigation of each of the 3 PhDs employed on the project. The first one comes from Rotterdam and the work of Vincent Walstra. This is one example of these spontaneous networks that are about distributing free food. This is on a temporary basis and was basically in connection with the COVID emergency and the partial lockdown experienced in the Netherlands, working on allocation provided for free in a community center with food donated by various types of donors, from supermarkets to social shops, and also making use of sustainable forms of transportation like this cargo bike. If you want to read more about each of these examples, I've provided examples on which each of the PhDs have written up blogs on the project website. What I want to stress about this particular example is its temporary nature, but also the fact that a lot of these networks have sprung up during the COVID emergency, mainly digitally, because at the time that was the easiest way to connect and also to interrogate each other about what could be done to help those in need at the moment. From Gdansk, I want to mention a different kind of example, an internal comparison, if you want, about an interrogation also about food sharing and food gifting. As I said, here we have one of the sides of the international movement called Food Not Bombs, which is largely spontaneous. It's about volunteers who self-organize in order to collect food that would go to waste, in this case from fresh food markets, and then cook it and provide pots of soup, usually directly in the streets, usually to homeless. But what is interesting about this example, also to tourists and passers-by. This is something that tells us about the particularity of this context, another gentrifying city that sees masses of people coming through, not particularly now during COVID, and the deliberate choice of these volunteers not to determine who would be deserving of receiving the free soup in the street. Anyone can receive it for free, tourists and homeless alike. So that sparked our imagination and our interrogation about moral categories like sharing and gifting, and a number of interesting peculiarities came up from the comparison, for example, between this example and the food bank of the city. The fact that actually both make use of volunteers. The fact that food is wasted anyhow, there are always leftovers, even in the food bank. And so, for example, how to reuse this wasted food for the second time is highly dependent on local legislation, national legislation, so is a particularly normated area. And you can read more about it on the Leiden Anthropology blog. A third example gives us a sense of how differently different contexts interpret and act upon similar situations. Again, in COVID times, a number of networks of self-help have sprung up in a number of places, including Turin. But interestingly, and this is what Maria Vasile points out here, self-help networks, solidarity networks, have also been very quick and vocal in voicing the fact that this should be connected with political demands, with demands to the local and national institutions about social needs that are being unmet. And the fact that actually in this particular case, these agents perceive, the social actors perceive that they're being left alone as volunteers, meeting actually needs that a welfare state should, an eroding welfare state should meet. What is interesting is also the fact that this particular instance emerges very clearly from this particular context, and it tells us how difficult it would be to compare, for example, this kind of self-help, even temporary networks and groups as a kind of general formula. Each instantiation speaks very much to the problems and to the social problematics of that particular context. So, for example, one of the interesting arguments that emerges from comparing and just juxtaposing these three sides is about the role of urban agriculture across Europe. What we see if we compare cities like, for example, Rotterdam and Turin, is that urban agriculture is being very much praised for its social outcomes, for its urban design qualities and potentials. But whenever there is a perk-up in the economy, as it was, for example, in the Netherlands up until the beginning of the COVID emergency, land for urban agriculture is quickly eroded by other types of interests. So while the social significance of this practice is highly valued also politically and in public discourse, its economic valuation remains problematic. Places like Turin and the particular example of the Orti Generali that Maria Vasile has been studying there also give us an example of how these marginal spaces can be appropriated in governance projects. In this particular case, this is about transitioning illegal practice of urban agriculture in sites that are actually not destined to food production. They're not being monitored or overviewed by the municipality, to more monitorable and therefore more coachable type of practices on sites that are being organized and set up also with the help of social foundations. If we juxtapose and compare this with other types of urban agriculture that has been long-term and traditional in Polish cities like Gdansk, we see that actually we have a lot to learn even just by looking inside Europe and different parts and quarters of Europe. I mention here this expression of quiet sustainability that has already been used in scholarship to analyze the food self-provisioning practices, especially of post-socialist countries, to show that urban agriculture combined with long-standing practices of pickling, canning, gathering, picking fruits and mushrooms, or provisioning food through direct supply from neighbors and farmers, are long-standing, long-running within societies like the Polish one, where at the same time, precisely because they are silent and kind of taken for granted and rather banal, they're also being eroded and overlooked in modeling innovation, governance, and sustainability. So I'm coming to the conclusion with insights that are still very much work in progress. In fact, I am meeting the authors of these blog posts back from the field, back from 15 months of fieldwork next Monday. So we're only beginning the data analysis. But the kind of insights that we can share as work in progress is to think about at least food procurement beyond the idea of sustainability fixes. This resonates a lot with some of the conclusions of Anna Davies as well in her presentation before. And also to complexify notions of scalability, not just because one size doesn't fit all. I mean, when you try and scale up a lot of these initiatives, they change nature, and it doesn't even make sense to think about scaling them up. But also because as they are at scale, they still have very different meanings side by side. Of course, as a cultural anthropologist, I like to point to the relevance of culture and to its diversity. I introduced it by using the notion of diversity of styles of participation, and especially alerting us, also as ERC grantees, to the diversity of these styles of participations and cultures, even across Europe, due to obviously the richness and diversity of histories, of models of politics and governance, of economic status and societal debates in each country and even region. And of course, the importance of ethnographic knowledge, which means basically this kind of anecdotal evidence that comes from coming to terms with the nitty-gritty of sometimes taken for granted practices that go under the radar and go unseen, and maybe actually quite defining for some styles of procurement and for some styles of participation. So that is my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, for that very interesting presentation. Now we have still good 20 minutes left for our question and answer session. We already received some questions, but while we are talking, you always can post new questions that we can integrate. So I will start with the first question that mainly goes to Christina and Anna working on food. So how does a food sharing affects the value creation measured by the GDP? So how we also received a similar question that how big is the potential of food sharing to replace conventional agriculture? So is it a very small part only? Is it just that, okay, maybe, yeah, a little, I mean, it can be once a week, we go less once a week for food shopping, or is it a big potential? So how big is it? Maybe Anna will start and then Christina.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very important and very common question. I mean, for people looking to resolve unsustainabilities in the food system, it's often the case that they want immediate shifts. So it's like, okay, so we know the current system is unsustainable and flawed in some ways. What's the replacement? But the reality is we need processes of transition. It's not going to happen overnight. There is no silver bullet to make or quick technical fix to do that, whether it's sharing or other forms of transactions. I mean, I guess from our perspective with Sharcity, the key insight there is that the potential is unknown to a certain extent until we provide the governing structure which allows these practices to expand. But I think it's important to think about the fetishization of GDP and financial measures really within this, because if we are solely looking to those measures to understand the worth and value of sharing, then we're missing all of these co-benefits which we've identified through the Share It tool and through co-designed practices and research. So really, and I think it's interesting, we have to understand that the current system we live in is also based on an ideology of economic growth. And we need to change that if we are to accept the co-benefits and the additional benefits which are provided by food sharing. So if you're just simply asking, can food sharing provide food provision for people, then you're not getting the full picture of what food sharing in terms of collective growing really can provide. So we need a different set of metrics, a different way of looking at what is the good life, if you like, for Europe going forward with respect to food. What we did in Sharcity was much more, it was a more than food approach. Food as a catalyst for social cohesion, food as a means to improve local urban biodiversity and reduce food waste. So I'm not sure if that entirely answers your question, because I think it's maybe about reframing the question to begin with. So it's not simply that food sharing becomes sort of dropped into the current system and then say, well, come on, then what do you do? the system itself needs some reorientation as well.
Thank you. Christina, do you want to add something?
Yeah, of course, I agree with everything Anna said. Perhaps I would just add this. The kind of examples I've distilled, I've chosen from the ethnography, really point at the political choice of not ignoring the fact that economic valuation and societal benefit and environmental sustainability need to be integrated. So if we only think about quantities of food produced or how they're going to impact the large organized distribution of food, when we are just not inputting enough factors in the equation really needs to be complexified, and it really needs to bring a lot more actors to the table.
Okay, thank you. Another question that was posted was, how do you see the link between the sharing and the non-sharing economy? I mean, do you want to take this? Christina, maybe, or Oksana?
Sharing and non-sharing, is it, as I mentioned a little bit in my presentation, there is a big disturbance created by the sharing economy in society at large. And we see, of course, how it challenges the prevailing business norms, how it challenges the prevailing institutions. It both disrupts in many ways. If you think about other sectors like taxis and hotels, been many cases where they have been disrupted, but also we see how they learn and then also kind of borrow the ideas and the services that sharing economy provides and develop their own services to match and be able to compete with sharing economy organizations. I think also, so it's a learning opportunity, and of course it's challenging, but also in many ways they also maintain existing institutions that are working. I think it's also they're challenging their very existence poses critical questions to city councils, whether to engage with them or not, whether to see them as threat or as opportunity, whether to regulate them in a way so that see to that sharing economy that really promote or support sustainability are gaining acceptance and prominence in society. So I would say there are so many different ways how sharing economy does influence the traditional way of living and governing the society.
Perhaps that I would just add, if we want to categorize under non-sharing, traditional economic actors and venues like markets, food markets. We looked particularly at open air markets. It was really interesting, even for me, to find out from the input and the work of the PhDs doing the ethnography, how porous the boundaries were between the usual suspects, the food activists, the food not bomb platforms, and these venues, these places where people meet, and perhaps they meet for economic reasons, like buying something coming from Italy. It's very exotic, it's very good, and then started thinking and talking and initiating social initiatives or participating in other type of platforms. So even the importance of socioeconomic hubs seems to be very interesting in the way in which then the other initiatives kind of cross-fertilize.
Okay, thank you. Anna, do you want to add something, or?
I was just going to say that similar to Christina, I mean, it really depends on what food sharing aspects you're looking at. So, for example, in food redistribution, there's lots of interaction between the mainstream supermarkets and food retailers and redistribution initiatives. I mean, that's a whole other can of worms if we open that up in terms of what that means and the power relations between those. elsewhere, there were good connections between different agencies in particular settings, as Christina mentioned, kind of access to food markets and things like that. I mean, I think it's quite useful to think about activities as being complementary in some context. I mean, what's being provided by a community garden is not being provided by any mainstream other alternatives currently in many cities. It's not that this is, you know, a non-commercial version of something else. The collaborative opportunities of community gardens are something that's different. In some cases, food sharing does substitute for say, commercial activities around, say, neighbourhood social dining experiences. In some cases, it's providing additional ways to access, consume, or redistribute food. So I think there's a variety of ways in which different food sharing initiatives either complement the mainstream or provide alternatives to it.
Okay, thank you. One more question, very concrete question to Christina, is that land is for urban gardening, land is really important. It's a key resource. How do you see the potential of vertical agriculture, using roofs or using buildings? Do you see there's a big potential there, or would you say that you can neglect that? Or do you investigate about that as well in your project?
Firstly, I'm not an expert on that, so it's not that I see potentials. Or what I can simply observe is that the kind of grassroots collective groups of food procurement that we worked with work with ready at hand spaces, tools, social opportunities. Whereas vertical agriculture seems to me to be a lot more connected with new tech initiatives and partnerships with capital or organizations. It can be the hospital, can be the firm or the enterprise that decides to redesign their facade, quite literally, also the way in which they participate in the urban landscape. So we haven't seen that. We haven't, it wasn't on our radar, and it doesn't seem to intercept the same kind of social actors that we've interacted with.
Okay, thank you. Anna, do you have something?
Well, similarly to Christina, I mean, the notion of urban vertical farming is an area of research in itself. Unless it has some collaborative activity, we didn't really engage with that. I mean, I suppose in the context of Singapore, which was one of the case study cities that we looked at, this was part of the landscape due to sort of socio-technical imaginaries that the state has around city as a garden, an intelligent nation, and shared values. So there are potential ways in which that model of vertical farming could incorporate a collaborative economy potential, but we're not seeing that currently. It's really pursued as a kind of efficient means of commercial activities for the most part. I mean, I'd love to hear if there are examples internationally of these kinds of activities that have adopted maybe a cooperative platform structure or other forms of collaborative interaction with local groups in their context, but I'm simply not aware of that currently.
Okay, thank you. Then we received another question that is directed to Oksana mainly, and that is one of your findings that you presented was that the smaller non-profit organization have a lot less influence than the big companies to governments and decision makers. So how do you see the consequences out of that? So what are the consequences?
Yes, unfortunately, that is what we are seeing. It's also a little bit what we, that's why the big and the loud, they are called like that, the big and the loud. And it's for both for the good and for the bad, in the sense that they are engaging very actively and they have the power and the muscle to negotiate with the cities and try to dictate to the cities what to do and how. On the other hand, they are the ones who are in the focus of the cities for regulating. So in that sense, we heard from many non-profit organizations that leave us alone. we don't want to be, associated with the sharing because there the regulatory focus is. At the same time, in other cities, we see that municipalities are engaging very much with supporting these non-profit organizations through, providing spaces and providing initial seed funding and so on. But of course, seeing that economically they have had much harder time to survive. So I think potentially one way for how these small organizations can gain power is through organizing, through, for example, these cross-industrial associations or sectoral sharing organizations who have the power and the voice for lobbying and for really pushing for, if you wish, sustainability of the sharing economy and for the survival of these organizations.
Thank you. Do the others want to add something from Anna or Christina? Okay, then we also received a question about scaling, because many of you presented some very small initiatives. How do you can compare these smaller initiatives? How do you quantify the outcome? Can you quantify somehow the outcomes? Can you scale it up and generalize from that? I think that we received that question for Christina, but I think the others can add something to that topic as well.
Yeah, I think my presentation is precisely about challenging this premise of scalability and generalization. The two premises are part of the same kind of thinking. The fact that knowledge is only knowledge if it is generalizable, and that small scale initiatives are important only if they're scalable. So I didn't have much time to go into that, but the qualitative methodology based on fieldwork that we use in anthropology, and that is actually used in a number of other disciplines, perhaps more radically so in our own, are precisely about this. It's precisely about understanding, if you want, context as a growth culture, as a metaphor, but taking it from science. There are so many factors that are key in creating the right combination that allows one particular type of initiative, of phenomenon, of network to work there and then because of this growth culture. And to think that you can simply take it and transpose it somewhere else or just make it bigger basically changes the nature of the initiative, its relevance, if you want. So the focus is on relevance rather than size. And if you think about relevance rather than size, that really forces you to rethink the epistemological premises. That means the premises about how do I make knowledge about that? What kind of knowledge do I need to look at relevant things rather than big things or general things? And I think that is the challenge, to develop a methodology for that.
Okay, thank you. We have only 1 minute left, so one last word from all of you. Just one sentence.
I'd just love to come into that and reiterate and support Christina's perspective on this. I think the notion of, we always look to ICT maybe to make the existing system more efficient, but the existing system has really been based on administrative efficiency as well. Big is beautiful because it's easy to govern. But now we have ICT that can deal with distributed systems. So let's think about maintaining this relevance focus through this socio-technical developments. We should be looking for these systems to allow things to be better for sustainability. So ICT for sustainability.
Oksana?
And my last word is that I'm thinking that together with preserving the cultural and socioeconomic conditions of the small examples, they can become the inspiration for many other localities where such initiatives could mushroom and flourish. So the small is not against mainstreaming. I think it's the mechanisms of how to do that, but context is the key, and this multiplication rather than growth.
Absolutely.
And diversity.
Okay, so time is up now. Thank you very, very much for being with us today. It was a pleasure to listen to your presentations, and thank you audience for the questions and for following us. And I wish all of you best luck with your research and your ESC projects. And thank ASOF for letting us present the topic.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you very much.